Hi, guys. Welcome back to another episode of First Date Unsolved, and welcome to part two of the Adolf Choyor story. Really quick, before I jump into the recap of part one, sorry, I mentioned last week that I would be announcing the winner of the cookie giveaway that we have going on with Cafecito Bistro, but Cafecito Bistro and I have decided to do two winners. I am picking a winner for Facebook and Instagram. All you have to do is like both of our pages on Facebook and or Instagram, share the post and like the post. That's it. Short and sweet, easy enough. We didn't want anybody to have to tag anybody, and we didn't want anybody to have to jump through hoops. That's a pain. So we didn't want to have to go through all that. You still have time to enter the giveaway. I will be announcing the winners next week. The winners will receive a box, half cookies and cream cookies, and half of the amazing Blue Velvet Cookie Monster cookies. I will reach out to the winners. We coordinate delivery or pickup or whatever. I'll make it as hassle-free as possible, just because I really do appreciate the support from everyone, and I appreciate any new support for my friend's business as well. So yeah, I thought this was a cool idea. I thought this was pretty fun. Cafecito Bistro agreed. It's pretty cool. So yeah, we're excited. With that out of the way, I won't do too much talking about business because I know I did that a lot last episode. Let's jump into a quick recap of Mr. Adolf here. So in episode 1, I mentioned Adolf was a German-born immigrant and made a living here in the U.S. working in a sausage factory over in South Jersey. Adolf migrated to the United States and settled in Delaware with his first wife, Elsa, and their oldest child in 1958. After 24 years of marriage and 3 children, the two divorced and Adolf remarried. Adolf and his second wife, Joan, moved to Bear, and that is where he lived out the last of his days. After a night of playing the ponies alone at Delaware Park on his 13th wedding anniversary, Adolf was rushed to Christiana Hospital and pronounced dead after what doctors originally thought was a heart attack. I did leave that part out of episode 1, but we'll get more into that in a few. Choyor was overweight, smoked heavily, and had diabetes. So I guess, a heart attack didn't seem completely out of the blue at the time. When Adolf's wife Joan arrived at the hospital in the very early hours of April 27th, 1996, she was met with the news that her husband had sadly passed. And that is where we are picking back up here for part 2. Usually I try not to name suspects or people of interest when I have access to that information, just because I don't feel like it's fair for me to speculate or implicate someone. But in this case, the person of interest has passed away. That person is no longer with us. And when I say everyone else, I mean everyone else has already done all of the speculating for me here. So there would be absolutely no reason for me to even be talking to you about this case today if poor Adolf had simply died from a heart attack. I'm sure we all figured out something went awry here. We are covering this story because the suspicious behavior of Mrs. Choyor after her husband's sudden death sparked much theorizing from not only the Choyor family, the Choyor children, but also police. So this is an interesting one, folks, to say the least. Now, Adolf and Joan's neighbor Fred Marini was very briefly mentioned in part 1, just before Adolf set out to Delaware Park for the last time. Fred and Adolf had enjoyed some coffee and cookies on Fred's porch prior to Adolf setting out to the casino and never returning. Fred and his wife Helen were very close with Mr. and Mrs. Choyor, and they were incredibly shocked when their phone rang at 5:30 a.m. the morning of April 27th. There weren't cell phones back then, and landlines can't be silenced or put on vibrate. So when the phone rang that early, Mr. and Mrs. Marini knew there couldn't be good news waiting for them on the other line. When they answered, they heard Joan's voice say, "Come over now, Adolf's dead." What a way to wake up, right? At 5:30 in the morning. The couple rushed over to their neighbor's home immediately. What they found when they arrived is not what you would expect from a grieving widow. Upon arrival, Joan rushed over to Helen and began to shake a metal bottle or vial in her face. Joan claimed to have found the container in her husband's pants pocket along with $21 in cash. Joan was demanding to know what had been in the bottle and why it was in her husband's pants pocket. Me personally, if I had been called in the middle of the night and told to rush to the hospital, only to arrive and find out that my husband had passed away out of nowhere, I'm not sure that one or any of my instincts would be to rummage through his pockets. I would be so overcome with so many emotions that going through his pockets would probably be the last thing to ever cross my mind, if it ever did at all. But I digress here. Helen and Fred were dumbstruck. They had no clue what could have possibly been in the bottle, and they had never seen it before. At all. Adolf had never mentioned any heart problems to Fred, and as a matter of fact, he never mentioned any heart problems to anyone. His shoulder pain and diabetes were ailments known to anybody close to Choyor. Issues with his heart were not. Joan even claimed to have no knowledge of any heart issues. She didn't even know if her husband had been seeing a doctor at the time. Easter of that year fell on Sunday, April 7th. Family had gathered at the Choyor home to celebrate that evening, and both of Adolf's daughters said that their father appeared normal. He had lost a little weight recently, but he carried on as his usual jolly self, and he prepared an entire meal for his loved ones. There was no indication to anyone that their father or friend would be dead just 20 days later. There was also no indication that, the next time they would see this man would be at his funeral. But before I go any further into the extremely odd behavior and events that took place on and after April 27th, I think it's a good idea to give you a little backstory on Joan and the relationships that she carried on with the people around her. When it comes to Joan and Adolf's marriage, the Choyor children couldn't really understand what it was about Joan that their father was attracted to. They once described her as petite and frail and thought she laid out in the sun too much. Joan was also described by a friend of the Choyor family as flighty. The friend of the family also mentioned that Joan loved taking people to court. Quote, "Joan never went into a supermarket that she didn't have a slip and fall accident in. She was notorious for that. I mean, that was her main source of income, was slip and fall accidents everywhere. If there was money to be had, Joan was going to find it." End quote. Now, this came off as odd to me because I also read that Joan grew up in a family with money. I can't relate to that. My parents didn't have money growing up. So I don't know. Maybe it's just hard for me to understand why someone who grew up so comfortably would turn around and, live such a life. I don't understand it at all. Insert shoulder shrug emoji. I don't know. Joan was also not known to be very affectionate. Adolf could be seen waiting on Joan hand and foot while she lounged around in the sun, smoking Pall Malls all day. There's a quote from Joan that was recorded in 1997, and she did say that she was proud to be Adolf's wife and that no man had ever been so good to her. And contrary to whatever affection Adolf showed Joan, Adolf's oldest daughter thought that the couple's marriage was more about companionship than actual love. She knew that her dad didn't want to be alone, and Joan enjoyed the partnership because she was allegedly, here's another quote, bleeding him dry, end quote. Joan had 4 children from her first marriage, 2 sons and 2 daughters. She loved her children dearly, and they were her everything. She also maintained a very close relationship with the father of her children and the man that she was married to for 28 years, Mr. Joe Reese. Joe and Joan divorced in 1981, which was just 1 year prior to Joan's marriage to Adolf. But they remained friends, and it is even speculated that Joan was still in love with her ex. I'm not entirely sure if Adolf and Joe had any kind of relationship at all, but he had to have known that Joan was still in contact with Reese because a close friend of Joan recalls that she talked about Joe constantly, even after her and Adolf got married. The friend stated, quote, "I don't think that she ever got used to the being divorced part," end quote. Okay. Now that you have a little bit of background on Joan and her flighty past, her flighty ways, and her extremely close relationship with her ex-husband, let's get back to April 27th. The events of that day were indeed weird, but things only got weirder as time went on. Fred Marini called Joan's behavior mind-boggling after her husband's death. Just hours after his passing, Joan's ex-husband Joe arrived at the couple's home and was seen by the Marinis trying on Adolf's members-only jacket. He said it was, quote, "a little snug, but it would work." Then roughly at 8:30 a.m., Joan enlisted Helen's help to go over life insurance paperwork. I mentioned the time because Adolf passed away just before 2:30 a.m. that morning. 6 hours later, his wife's main focus was determining how much he was worth, and her ex-husband is rummaging through Adolf's belongings to find out what he can and cannot benefit from. Yikes. Between Choyor's life insurance policy and his profit-sharing plan, Mrs. Choyor was looking at a payout of roughly $75,000. $75,000 in 1996 would equal out to roughly $127,000 today. That's not a bad chunk of change if you ask me. Joan was so pleased with the payout that she hired a limo for her and the kids the day of Adolf's funeral. She also had a special headstone customized for Adolf and specifically had his grave face the direction of Delaware Park, which is less than 1.5 miles from the cemetery where he rests. His headstone has a horse engraved in the bottom right corner, which pays tribute to his love of gambling on races. And his headstone also displays words in German which translate to rest gently. Now, I don't think any of this is in bad taste, but Joan did inform Adolf's children that she would not be footing the bill for the burial plot, and that part is a little weird considering the hefty payout she received. It was also pointed out that the widow did not shed a single tear on the day of her late husband's ceremony. She interviewed with the News Journal at one point, and she said, "He had a smile on his face at the funeral, so I didn't shed a tear." I have so many thoughts on this, but to be fair, every single person grieves differently, so I'm going to leave that there for you to all unpack on your own. At the time of Adolf's passing, a routine autopsy was done at the hospital, and the results seemed to confirm the suspicion that the cause of death was in fact a heart attack. However, within a week of his death, the medical examiner's office received an anonymous phone call regarding Choyor and his cause of death. The caller has never been identified, to my knowledge, but it was revealed that the individual was a woman and a neighbor. The caller questioned how sure the medical examiner was that Adolf died of a heart attack and alluded to the fact that something more sinister had taken place. After this call, more toxicology reports were ordered, and 7 weeks later, the results confirmed the concerned caller's suspicions. Choyor's cause of death was changed from a heart attack to homicide, and the weapon used to kill him, cyanide. Not long after the funeral, Joan's ex-husband moved into the trailer with her, and the two of them slowly started to remove all signs of Adolf from his own home. The oldest of the Choyor children, Jeanette, went by the trailer Adolf and Joan shared in June of 96, only to find that items like her father's car and golf clubs were gone. The Choyor children never received a dime of the money that was paid out after his death, and Joan never even asked them if they wanted any of their father's belongings after he passed. Jeanette did manage to collect some important items like some of his shot glasses and the American flag that he was gifted when he officially became a U.S. citizen. Other than that, Joan and her children had little contact with Adolf's children after his funeral, and it seemed as though everything was behind Joan and all was calm and quiet, at least for a little while. 6 months after Choyor's death, police paid Joan and Joe a little visit. In October of 1996, detectives knocked on Joan's door to inform her that her husband's death had been ruled as a homicide and that an investigation was being launched. Seeing as how cyanide is not something you can just run to the nearest pharmacy and pick up, detectives knew that they were looking at a small number of possible suspects. But the unfortunate delay in the beginning of the investigation was not going to help matters. Police started with Delaware Park. If you recall, I mentioned in part 1 that when Adolf sat down in his usual chair, both of the booths on either side were empty. But Choyor could have ordered something to eat or drink, and someone could have easily walked up for a quick chat and went unnoticed. Delaware Park had a policy, may still have it, I'm not entirely sure, but if nothing of significance takes place, then the surveillance footage is erased every 2 weeks. Since Adolf's death was originally listed as a heart attack, there was no need to keep the footage, so it was erased, and that ended up being a dead end. And here, if I don't know if you thought the behavior before was messy or not, but here is where it really starts to get messy. Again, I don't like to point fingers. I am just relaying facts. It was actually kind of hard for me to segue into this next bit because it's almost impossible not to sound like I'm blaming a specific person or persons. And unfortunately, this is just one of those situations, almost like the Jantel Johnson case in episode 1 of the podcast, where evidence specifically points in a direction, but there's just never enough evidence to arrest that individual or individuals. In an interview that Joan did in April 1997, she stated that she had been labeled as a suspect and that police had been questioning her. While this may have been a shock to her, the spouse or significant other is always questioned when something like this happens. And that's probably because statistically, the spouse is usually the one who commits the murder. What shocked me, though, is that once she knew she was under a microscope, she decided to pull accusations out of thin air and claim that her husband had dug himself so deep into a hole with his gambling that he decided to poison himself. Her theory was that Adolf must have had cyanide hidden in the trunk of his car for years. He was born in Germany, and after all, they use that kind of stuff over there all of the time. So, if Joan was correct, when Adolf came to the U.S. in 1957, he brought some cyanide over with him and just kept it hidden in his trunk or wherever all of these years, just in case. She laid out this scenario that her husband lost big the night of his death and just couldn't go on living. So he went out to his car, ingested the poison, and then went back into the casino and waited to die. As bizarre as this sounds, cyanide does take roughly 30 minutes to kill someone after exposure. And it is true that Nazis did use cyanide to carry out their senseless genocide, but Adolf and his family were never associated with the Nazis. His own sister, Christina, even called Joan's claims hogwash and stated that when World War II ended, her brother was just 10 years old. How in the world is a 10-year-old going to get their hands on Nazi cyanide? The Choyor family had no reason to believe that Adolf was suicidal in any capacity. Even Fred Marini, who spent the afternoon with Adolf, said that there was nothing about his friend that would give any indication of depression or suicide. No one else who remotely knew Adolf had any reason to believe that he would take his own life. The toxicology reports that came back also backed up what the family and Fred's were saying. While the levels of cyanide in Adolf's blood were enough to kill him, the levels were not anywhere near what typically is seen in a suicide by cyanide situation. Generally, when a person chooses to take their own life using cyanide, the levels in their blood are sky high because the individual isn't sure how much to take, so they overdo it. What was found in Adolf's case was a clear indication of intentional poisoning. Regardless of Joan's theory, cyanide was never discovered on or near Adolf, and one would think that if it had been discovered in his home at some point, the finder would have come forward with it. But police did discover one connection to the chemical and a member of Adolf's family. One of Joan's daughters worked at a chemical company as a material control operator. Investigators determined that the daughter had access to multiple substances containing varying levels of cyanide through her position. This put a giant target on Joan and her daughter. Both were named persons of interest. With all of this new information coming out, lines were being drawn and signs were being taken. Joan's family and friends couldn't fathom that she would have anything to do with killing her loving husband. Adolf's family and friends didn't know exactly what to believe, but they knew that Adolf didn't do this to himself. As you can imagine, there was a lot of back and forth over this. A lot of allegations being thrown around, right? Joan said that her daughter was embarrassed by the accusations, and Joe knew in his heart that neither Joan nor his daughter had anything to do with Adolf's death. The two were so determined to clear their names that they went against all advice and both agreed to take a polygraph test. The results of Joan's test came back as inconclusive. Her daughter's results were a little different. Quote, Teresa showed behaviors indicative of deception in regards to one question concerning the taking of any chemicals from her work, end quote. And that's according to police. Now, Delaware is one of the very few states that will allow the results of a lie detector test in court. And as exciting as that is, no other concrete evidence could be dug up, and no one was ever charged with Adolf's murder. The death of Adolf Choyor is now considered a cold case by the state of Delaware. Madeline Joan Thomas Reese lived to be 80 years old. She passed away in January of 2013, surrounded by her loved ones. In the very beginning of her obituary, it states that, quote, she was reunited with her beloved husband Joe and her son Kenny, end quote. Joe is actually listed in the obituary twice and is called her husband both times. Adolf's name is not mentioned in her obituary at all. Adolf's children still miss him dearly. It's nice that Joan was surrounded by people who loved her the most when she passed, but it sucks that Adolf wasn't given the same opportunity. I'm sure we are all thinking the same things right now, and I hope that I don't come off as too accusatory here, but the facts available speak for themselves. And money was absolutely a motive here, one way or another. At least that's my take. And here I go with opinions again. Sorry. But, that's it, guys. That's it for Mr. Adolf Choyor. He sounded like a very normal guy, especially in this country, the American dream. You come here as an immigrant, you work hard, you make a living, you raise your family. And the goal for all of us is to, retire at some point. No one wants to work till they die. And he was on that path. It's just, it's sad that whatever happened, however it happened, it's sad that it happened. And, his family at this point, I don't think they'll get any answers. And that's unfortunate. But you know what, guys? Thanks for listening. I appreciate it. We're here at episode 8, almost done season 1. I appreciate all the love, all the support. And if you thought nothing ever happened here, boy, you thought wrong.